NHS system leaders today to begin the process of making sure those triage standards are rolled out, along with some of the other urgent measures that I've spoken about today. So whilst it is right to take time to get the comprehensive action plan in place by the end of the year, on those measures where we have decided we will progress more quickly, we don't want to waste time by getting on with that. So the NHS England leadership is progressing with that today. He asked about the funding I mentioned, which is for critical safety works in the maternity estate. That is important work for critical safety measures, whilst of course the action plan will set out a more comprehensive approach, not just to the physical infrastructure, but as we've spoken about many times, the culture as well, which is not something you can invest money in the same way you can physical infrastructure, but it is something we need to address, and I think we all agree on that. I sense I had agreement from the House when I raised the importance of addressing cultural problems in maternity services. He asked about the responsibility that might be put on the Commissioner, being as they will be just one person, and I would like to reassure him that my vision of this is for the Commissioner to play a crucial role, but not on their own. You know, they will co-chair with me the National Task Force. They will help to make sure the National Action Plan is implemented. They will hold the system to account. And crucially, they will be a voice for women within the system. So when decisions are being taken by government in response to what I've heard so many times about women being ignored in maternity services, one way of starting to address that is to make sure the Commissioner is a voice for them when decisions are taken. The temporary roles for newly qualified midwives that I mentioned are an immediate step this year to make sure that those newly qualified midwives have a way into the NHS to make a contribution to maternity services. It will then, the funding for that will then be baselined in future years, and it will be for trusts to decide on a trust-by-trust basis how the funding is distributed amongst different roles, because it will vary depending on their needs in local areas. He also spoke about the importance of identifying women who are at higher risk because of different circumstances or problems they may face giving birth. That is exactly what I hope the new triage standards will begin to address, because if the triage standards can identify issues earlier before they escalate and make sure that women have the right support quicker, that can give us an opportunity to avoid extra harm which is avoidable coming to those women by the delay in getting them the right support that they need. And then finally, Madam Deputy Speaker, the Shadow Secretary of State closed his remarks by talking again about culture, the need for the change in culture, and for the support from the opposition, whilst of course robustly challenging us where appropriate, but supporting the aims we're seeking to achieve, and I thank him again for that.
Before I call the next member, members can all sit down. Three things I wish to say. Firstly, that the Secretary of State for Defence will commence his statement at 2:30, so time will be limited. Members may help each other if they ask short questions. Until then, the Macmillan Room in Portcullis House and Committee Room 7 are available as reading rooms for the Defence Investment Plan, and the plan will be made available from the moment that the Secretary of State for Defence stands up when he begins his statement at 2:30. Where's Streeting?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I add my thanks to Baroness Amos and join the Secretary of State in emphasising the importance of culture change. But culture change won't happen without accountability. And of all of the conversations I had with families who are suffering bereavement or harm for themselves or for their children, the thing that shocked me most is the cover-up culture in the NHS, which continues to persist to this day, and was, I think, exposed once again by Donna Ockenden in her report last week. So given this, and there is a legitimate debate to be had about whether we continue with place-based inquiries or have a statutory public inquiry nationally, I think we have to have that debate. But whatever the answer to that question, it's only worth the paper it's written on if all of those involved in decision-making and care are held to account with a duty of candour. So given that, where is the Hillsborough law? because it's important not just for justice for the 97, but also for these families and to prevent future harms. Will that law at least go through this House before the summer recess? Because until it's on the books, people continue to duck answering real questions.
State.
Well, I thank my right honourable friend for his comments, and let me again, Madam Deputy Speaker, put on record my thanks and tribute to him for having initiated the investigation that Baroness Amos has published today. I know what a committed champion he has been of change when it comes to maternity services in this country, and I think he's absolutely right, and I couldn't agree with him more when he talks about the importance of accountability for culture change. Without that accountability, we will not have culture change across maternity services. The culture of cover-ups will continue. Senior clinicians will feel they can continue to get away with mistakes when they happen. Senior clinicians will feel they can avoid scrutiny when investigations take place, and they will fundamentally continue, in too many cases, to be more concerned with protecting themselves than protecting women and babies. And so I very much agree with him about the importance of that. In terms of what we can do to change that culture, culture is deep-rooted and requires us to take a number of different actions, but I think the duty of candour is the one single most powerful change we can make clearly, loudly, publicly, because the message it will send to senior clinicians thinking about what to do in the future if they make a mistake or if they are tempted to cover up things that go wrong in the future is that one day they will be held to account, and there is no avoiding that. Because with a duty and candour in place, there will no longer be an opportunity for clinicians, senior clinicians in particular, to refuse to engage in that process, to refuse to be held to account, be part of the justice process. People will face up to 2 years in prison if they refuse to cooperate, so it is a serious measure, and I very much agree with him on the importance of making sure the Hillsborough law gets on the statute books so that this duty of candour can apply to future maternity investigations.
Liberal Democrat spokesperson Helen Morgan.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. May I also add my thanks to the Secretary of State and to Baroness Amos and her team and the families that have relived the pain of their experience in order to bring about this report today. But the Amos report tells us little that we didn't already know. Indeed, it confirms our worst fears. Maternity services in England are fundamentally broken, with the cost of political neglect being paid in trauma, injury and lost lives. Figures revealed by the Liberal Democrats in the last week show that the first quarter of 2026 saw the worst rate ever recorded for maternity injuries. In fact, while the number of reviews into NHS maternity services has steadily ticked up, we've also seen rising maternal mortality rates. Now, 4 years ago, I spoke in this chamber in response to the findings of the Shrewsbury and Telford review, which were devastating for my own community. And last week, I stood here really distressed, actually, as we heard further traumatic reports from the Nottingham review. But anger isn't enough. The government must meet this moment now and implement Baroness Amos's recommendations in full and without delay, or the families simply won't forgive them. To do this, we need genuine accountability through the NHS and the Department of Health and Social Care, accompanied with the investment needed to make Britain the safest country in the world to have a baby. Now, we welcome the government's commitment to a National Maternity Commissioner, a long-standing Liberal Democrat campaign, and also the other urgent and immediate actions that the Secretary of State has outlined in the last week. They are all urgent and signs of taking this seriously. But we need to recognise that a Commissioner alone cannot fix the broken system. So I urge the Secretary of State to work with us and look at our maternity rescue package for inspiration for his action plan. It has a great degree of overlap with Baroness Amos's recommendations. Our package would ensure one-to-one midwifery care for every woman in labour, additional senior midwives, an obstetrician on every ward, and mandatory updated annual training. So will the government commit here and now to implementing all of those recommendations and working with us to deliver the change we need?
Secretary of State.
Well, I thank the Honourable Lady for her comments, and I think she puts it very well when she talks about Baroness Amos's investigation as confirming our worst fears. I think I was shocked but not surprised, sadly, to read the investigation report. It was devastatingly familiar to read what it set out as being the failings across the country. The recommendations from Baroness Amos's report will now become part of the work of the task force, which I chair, to produce the comprehensive action plan by the end of this year. And my intention is that the task force will take all of the national recommendations from Baroness Amos's report, as well as the national level recommendations from Donna Ockenden's report last week, and recommendations from any other investigations and reports, and make sure that the action plan it produces comprehensively addresses all of the issues it raised. Because I think we would all agree that there isn't 1, 2, 3, a small number of actions we need to take. This has to be a comprehensive plan to truly transform the service.
Mother of the House, Diane Abbott.
The Secretary of State will know that for very many women, they are never more vulnerable than in childbirth. And it's not just the vulnerability, but the horror of what women and their babies are exposed to in childbirth. And we see inquiry after inquiry, and nothing seems to improve. And very many of those women who are suffering in childbirth are black women and their babies. And the Secretary of State himself said to me, black babies are still more than twice as likely to be stillborn than white babies, and black women are almost 3 times more likely to die during pregnancy or shortly after birth than white women. The whole House wants to see progress made on this issue, but it isn't enough to have another inquiry. It isn't enough to have another report. What black women and their babies want is equity of treatment and fewer black women and their babies die.
Secretary of State.
Well, I thank my right honourable friend for her comments, and I agree with her about how shocking the failures in maternity services are, particularly because these failings and the failure to listen to women happens at a point at which they are at their most vulnerable. It's at that moment when they are let down, when they need the NHS the most, is when the NHS fails them. And that is one aspect of this that makes it truly devastating. She also rightly highlights the inequalities and the impact on black women and their babies, black women and their babies being at more risk than white women and their babies, and the inequality that exposes. As I mentioned during my earlier statement, we will begin by making sure the perinatal equity and anti-discrimination programme is extended to all trusts by the end of next year. But that is an immediate measure we're taking rather than the sum of all measures we'll take on this front. And the inequality, racism, discrimination will be a central part of the action plan that the task force develops.
Jeremy Hunt.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I strongly agree with the former Secretary of State's comments about the need for getting the culture right with accountability? When I was Secretary of State, we passed the duty of candour regulations. They were supposed to make it, they do make it a criminal offence for trusts not to tell the truth to families when a tragedy has happened. Yet to this day, trust lawyers advise doctors, nurses and midwives not to be open about what's happened when there is the prospect of legal action further down the line. So will the Secretary of State, who I know is very committed to this, but will he agree that in the Hillsborough law we will clear up this anomaly so that it is just not possible for trusts not to tell the truth, and trust lawyers always advise their own doctors, nurses and midwives they must tell families exactly what happened?
Right, I thank the right honourable gentleman for his comments and again agree with him and my right honourable friend from Milford North about the importance of accountability in terms of changing culture. I think when he made a contribution to the statement last week about Donna Ockenden's report, he made a comment around how this is about having accountability structures embedded throughout the system, because this is not something the top of the NHS Chief Executive or the Secretary of State or ministerial team can control throughout the NHS. The structure has to be embedded to make sure accountability happens at every level, which is something I very much took to heart and agree with in terms of what we need to do next. On his specific point about the Hillsborough law and how that will address the issue that he refers to about legal departments advising effectively a cover-up of what has happened, I will look into that because that does sound concerning, and I will look into that as part of our work to make sure this works properly. The expectation with the duty of candour, which will come in under the Hillsborough law, is to make sure that we can never again have a situation, as happened in Nottingham, and I couldn't quite believe it, if I'm honest, when I heard it, about how many senior clinicians simply refused to take part. You know, it is outrageous. It is unacceptable that so many senior clinicians were able to and felt able to just say no. You know, that is not accountability if it's optional. And that's what we need to change. And I'll look into the point you raised specifically.
Andy McNair.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. I, of course, usually welcome the report and join in a thanks to all that have made it possible, but most fundamentally the families who shared their experience, who showed extraordinary courage through the whole process. Many of those stories were shared with us in the all-party group for baby loss. I'd like to assure those families that we will carry on listening to them and carry on being a voice for them through this process. There are many powerful recommendations in the report. I welcome the delivery plan and the Maternity Commissioner, but fundamentally, the government must retain responsibility for the ultimate outcomes. So following the exploration of the National Maternity Safety Ambitions in 2025, will Secretary of State now recommit to meaningful targets to reduce stillbirths and neonatal deaths and reduce a target to finally fully eliminate inequalities in baby loss?
Secretary of State.
I thank my honourable friend, and he draws an important point out here, which is that in developing the National Action Plan that I referred to earlier, a key part of developing it is to make sure we have the right metrics, the right mechanisms for monitoring its implementation, and the right structures in place for making sure it's implemented across all trusts. And in working with the members of the task force, I will make sure that those accountability mechanisms about the delivery of the plan itself are in place, because I've spoken many times today about the importance of recommendations not sitting on shelves. We need to make sure we have the structures in place such that the actions in the National Action Plan are implemented, we can see they're being implemented, and we can give people the confidence that that is the case.
Chair of the Health Select Committee, Leila Moran.
I too would like to put on the record my thanks to Baroness Amos, her team, but most especially the families who so bravely gave evidence that has formed this report today. Further to the conversation that we are having about accountability, he will have noticed that there are some families who are concerned about the role of the Commissioner. Their concern is that the Commissioner is just one person and that there's too much for them to do. Can he just make clear the buck stops with him, doesn't it? And indeed the PM, and that he won't let go of this. The Commissioner will report every 6 months to the Health and Social Care Select Committee. We welcome that, and once a year to Parliament. But further to that, would he personally commit that the Secretary of State will come to the House once a year and seek permission from the Speaker so that they can be held personally accountable for the progress too?
State.
I thank the Honourable Lady, and in describing the role of the Commissioner, I think she is right to emphasise that it cannot all be on one person. The Commissioner, I think, is a vital role, and it being on a statutory basis will give that position real weight within the system to hold the system to account and help the government to ensure the implementation of the comprehensive National Action Plan. But she is right to say that ultimately this is something for which accountability has to include the Secretary of State and the Prime Minister, because it is a duty that we all hold as MPs, we hold as a government, I hold as a Secretary of State, and the Prime Minister ultimately will hold that responsibility too. So it's not in any sense intended to be a passing of responsibility to a Commissioner. The Commissioner role is being established to support the effectiveness of the work we're seeking to do as a government to implement the National Action Plan, but crucially, when accountable politicians are taking decisions, the Commissioner will be a voice for women in the system, because I have heard so many times about, not just in relation to maternity services, also in terms of other parts of healthcare, women's voices not being heard, but particularly in terms of maternity services, particularly in terms of when things go wrong and women have concerns of maternity services, their voices are not heard. And so this Commissioner will be a way of making sure those voices are right at the very heart of decision making.
Florence Eshalomi.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I thank the Minister and Secretary of State for making this statement this afternoon. I also want to pay tribute to the noble Baroness Amos for the work and care and dedication they've taken in this report, and to the many women who came forward with their testimonies. And I think back to just over 9 years ago, when I was giving birth to my second son, and the concerns that I raised, and to think that 9 years on, women are still being dismissed, women are still not being listened to, women are still being silenced when they raise those valid concerns. But I also do want to pay a tribute to the hard-working midwifery team at St Thomas's Hospital across the river, who continue to care for many women. And to highlight the Southwark Maternity Commission, led by Councillor Evelyn Okoto, and the work of organisations like 5 Times More. Many organisations that continue to expose some of the issues faced by black and minority ethnic women. We also have to highlight the concerns of black minority ethnic staff, who are in some cases told that they do not want to be served and they do not want to be helped. Can the Secretary of State outline when this real action plan will come through in terms of the accountability that many others have raised, in terms of making sure that the doctors and clinicians do actually listen to these women?
I thank my honourable friend, and the action plan, which will be developed through the task force that I chair and that the Commissioner will co-chair when that position is established, will publish its National Action Plan by the end of this year. That will take on all of the or consideration of all of the recommendations from Baroness Amos's report, as well as John Ockenden's reports. But I think there's also a point that my honourable friend makes, which I think is worth drawing attention to, which is the many midwives and others working in maternity services who do a really important job, work really hard to provide excellent care to women. That's not to diminish the scale of the failings, but it's to give the right perspective on all those midwives who do a really important job and work hard to care for women and their babies. And I think it's evidenced by the fact, Madam Deputy Speaker, that in Baroness Amos's investigation, 9,000 members of staff came forward to give evidence. That's because they're concerned. That's because they want to see change as well. So whilst this is, of course, about women and their babies and their families primarily, staff also have a really important voice in this, and we need to improve the system so that they can make their contribution as well.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. This week last year, I had multiple pulmonary emboli only a few weeks after giving birth, and I'm very grateful to Dr. Laura Stevens, who saved my life and then was punished for having ordering the test that found that I'd had multiple pulmonary embolisms. Blood clots are the #1 cause of pregnancy and postnatal births, and yet there is not a word about the risk of them in any pregnancy pack given out in this country. The National Action Plan will fail if it does not tackle blood clots as the #1 cause of maternal deaths. So will the Health Secretary kindly meet with me, work with me, and make sure together we can save lives?
Secretary of State.
Well, I thank the honourable lady for sharing her experience and for raising the importance of this issue from her experience, but also for the benefit of maternity services more widely. I'm very happy for myself or ministerial team to meet with her to discuss this in detail, because it's very important that that is part of the National Action Plan and our wider response.
Joan Craft.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And I very much welcome the report and the work done by Baroness Amos to highlight the failings across our maternity system. It is pure and utter medical misogyny that has led us here. The value that we place on the lives of women and the experiences of women has been brought to the fore, and it is very, very low. I think that the through lines throughout the entire report, and the ones we've seen previously, are that women's voices weren't heard, their pain wasn't believed, their experiences were completely and utterly disregarded, and this must change. In terms of specifics, I would like to add my voice as well to those colleagues who are calling for measures to address the disparity in treatment between black and ethnic minority women. And I would call that training, proper training and continuous professional development is put in place to make sure that black women do not have the kind of experiences that we have seen to date. And I would also plead with the Secretary of State to make sure that there are real accountability measures in anything put forward. It cannot be right that I have a maternity unit that is inadequate and has always been inadequate or requires improvement, but yet I have not seen a senior member of staff ever pulled over the coals for this happening. That has to change.
I thank my honourable friend, and she's absolutely right to call this for what it is in many cases, which is misogyny in maternity services, and of course to draw attention to the different impact on different mothers, the racial and ethnic inequality that there is within the system. The anti-discrimination programme I mentioned, which is being rolled out over the next year and a half, that will be an important first step, but that cannot be the sum total of what we do to address discrimination and inequality. That will be a focus of the National Task Force, as will, to repeat a point many members have rightly made today, accountability, because it's only by embedding that accountability throughout the system that we can be truly confident of change.
Andrew George.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I, like others, of course, welcome this report. The Secretary of State referred to Dr. Bill Kirkup, who, of course, resigned from the Amos review as advisor because he felt that the review was skirting around certain birthing ideologies and caesarean targets. He also said in his statement that staff shortages can have a dangerous impact, and indeed they can. And although he and Baroness Amos refer to culture, a lot of that culture is to do with budgetary and other pressures which result in members of staff on the front line being discouraged and belittled from blowing the whistle about unsafe staffing levels on the front line. So will the Secretary of State look again at the report and consider for the first time actually introducing mandatory safe staffing on the front line for these services?
I thank the honourable gentleman. He raises important points around staffing and, of course, training to make sure that the right staff, the right levels of training, the right structures are in place. I know from having seen Baroness Amos's report and indeed from the recommendations from Donna Ockenden's report last week that those questions will be central to the work of the task force in developing the National Action Plan, because whilst there is not, as I've said a few times today, simply one or two levers we need to pull or actions we need to take to make change, those are clearly central to what we need to be doing.
Josh Fenton-Glynn.
Deputy Speaker, just echoing what my colleague from the Select Committee said, Baroness Amos pointed to workforce challenges and their impact on care and safety. She noted that 67% of midwives reported burnout. Meanwhile, the GMC survey found that 63% of Obs and Ghani trainees had a high or very high workload. That's higher than the 42% average. The workforce plan has to address these problems, will it?
State.
I thank my honourable friend, and his question around staffing and around making sure that we have not only the right levels of staffing but the right responsibilities of different people in the service to ensure that we don't have individual members of staff suffering from burnout and workloads which they can't cope with are critical questions which the task force will consider as part of its development of the National Action Plan.
Sir Julian Lewis.
Last Wednesday and again today, the Secretary of State expressed his shock at the number of senior clinicians who refused to take part in the Nottingham Review. Can I repeat a suggestion I made then, which is that those clinicians should be named publicly? This is a step he could take straight away. So if a parliamentary question for written answer is put down, asking him to name those clinicians, will he answer it? I can't think of a better or more justifiable use for parliamentary privilege.
Secretary of State.
I thank the right honourable gentleman. I will take away his suggestion and think on it because it is important, was critical that we have accountability. And I find, as I said earlier, in response to other questions, I find the decision by senior clinicians not to take part in the Nottingham inquiry utterly unacceptable, utterly incomprehensible on a personal level, and something we must make sure never happens again.
Dr. Ben Coleman.
Oh, I'm not a doctor, but thank you so much. maybe from the University of Life, who knows? Thank you very much, Deputy Speaker. And I'd like to pay tribute both to Baroness Amos for this excellent report and also to my honourable friend, the member for Ilford North, for commissioning it in the first place. I think it's a remarkable piece of work, and following on Ockenden and following on the report that my own Health Select Committee, with the chair of which sits opposite, has done into black maternal health, we see again and again the same problems: misogyny, racism, lack of accountability. And I'm delighted, therefore, that we are going to have this plan developed in 6 months through the task force, but also that we're having a maternity commissioner. And I know that my constituent, Louise Thompson, who has been campaigning hard for this position to be created, will be delighted. But I would also think that, like me, she will have a question about timing. Will it be possible for the Commissioner, who will be introduced on a statutory basis, to be brought in quickly enough for this person to have a full role in shaping, in creating the plan that's going to be before us in 6 months, or not? And if not, why not?
Secretary of State.
I thank my honourable friend, and he asks about the timing and the process for establishing a Commissioner. The first step is that within the next 2 weeks, I'll be meeting with members of the task force to agree the scope and detailed role for the Commissioner, because I want that scope and role to be agreed with members of the task force, given they're going to be developing the National Action Plan. We then need to get the Commissioner on a statutory basis. I want to get on a statutory basis as quickly as possible. I'm keen to look for options through the Health Bill, but that will obviously be subject to discussions with the parliamentary usual channels about that. Once that's in place, we can then appoint the Commissioner as quickly as possible. But I think it's worth me emphasising that the role of the Commissioner will be in implementing the National Action Plan. So the work on developing the National Action Plan will begin immediately. The work on establishing the Commissioner will also begin immediately. Whenever the Commissioner is appointed, they will have a role in implementing the National Action Plan, because it's not simply about developing a national plan, it's about making sure it gets implemented and that we hold trusts and other organisations across the system to account in making that implementation happen.
Rosie Duffield.
Madam Deputy Speaker, our APPG on birth trauma report in 2024, which was the first in Parliament, we heard from over 1,300 women and families, and it was entitled Listen to Mums. And I'm glad that our years of calls for an independent maternity commissioner are finally going to be implemented. Bill Kirkup's headline finding in his 2023 review of East Kent was also listen to women. The Health Secretary has again repeated the importance of listening to women, women who are the mothers, the midwives, the experts, and even the MPs here working for years on this issue. Why does he think we haven't been listened to, or often not even invited to be in the room? And how will he work to provably change that in his time in the department?
Well, I thank the honourable lady, and she's, of course, absolutely right to draw attention further to the issue of women being ignored in health services generally, but specifically in terms of maternity services. And I think that this goes back to the question of culture. I think that the culture which is in maternity services, it's a devastating conclusion to come to, but seeing that culture is there of misogyny, of women being ignored, of women's concerns not being listened to and acted upon, that is the culture that we need to change. And one of the first actions we can take to change that culture is accountability, is making sure that accountability through the duty of candour that we've discussed and through other actions we can take to enhance accountability throughout the system is a critical first step in making sure that we change that culture.
Michelle Welsh.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I welcome Baroness Valerie Amos's review and wish to thank her and her team for their commitment to this vital work. But once again, this review confronts us with a very uncomfortable truth, but a very real truth, a reality, that this inquiry, the inquiry into Donna Rockington, did not come about because of a system, it did not come about because of NHS England or a regulatory authority. It came about because families have to keep on speaking up and over again what is one of the most horrific and traumatic things ever to happen. All whilst there was a culture within of mutual protection and a code of silence, where some staff have shielded each other from consequences. I welcome the recommendation on the National Maternity and Neonatal Commissioner, a strong independent voice with power to challenge. But we know that one appointment alone will not solve these problems. We need fundamental reform of the wider system of oversight and accountability. Regulators and NHS bodies and inspection regimes must change. Reviews do not save life, action does. We need strong leadership, big bold decision making and a determination to implement change rather than simply recommend it.
Secretary of State.
My honourable friend is absolutely right, and may I again put on record my thanks to her for supporting families in their fight for justice and accountability. She's absolutely right to say it is families who have driven this. It's families who have had a determination and a persistence, a stamina, which is quite hard to imagine when people are dealing with such unimaginable pain that lasts their whole life. But that is what families have done, and that is why I feel it is our responsibility to make sure they don't have to drive that alone, that we as MPs, as government ministers, as Secretary of State for Health, support families in that drive for accountability, for justice and for change. My honourable friend is absolutely right as well. This must be about a fundamental reform, and that must include all parts of the system, including the regulators who far too often have let women down.
Sir Bernard Jenkins.
Mr. Speaker, how much will the Secretary of State keep an open mind as to whether it is right to abolish the Health Services Safety Investigation Body, which was specifically designed to provide for a duty of candour? Clinicians would be obliged to give evidence to HSIB. They could not refuse, and there are criminal penalties if they do so. The duty of candour, as conceived in the Hillsborough Law, and as we already have established, does not work. And I suspect there will be no improvement unless HSIB is allowed to carry out completely independent investigations, which have also proved they can carry public confidence and of patients and of clinicians. Will he keep an open mind about keeping HSIB?
Well, I thank the right honourable gentleman for his question. I know this is an issue that he feels strongly about and he's raised with me before. My colleague, the Minister of State for Health, who is taking the NHS modernisation bill through Parliament, is leading on the changes we're seeking to make around HSIB and the CQC. I hear what he's saying, but my honourable friend has set out clearly the government's rationale for the changes we're seeking to achieve and what that will accomplish.
Marsha de Cordova.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I also want to pay tribute to Baroness Amos for this report that she has published. But the scale, this report really lays bare the scale of racism and discrimination within maternity and neonatal care. This is not a surprise to anyone because this is an issue that I and many other honourable members in this place have been raising for years. So I do welcome the recommendation to root out racism and discrimination within those services. But more broadly, we all know that there are structural inequalities that exist across the NHS, whether we like it or not, and we do need to hold those responsible accountable. So can the Secretary of State share a little bit more about how he intends to be held accountable in this place, but also to hold those senior clinicians accountable for their actions, because we need to root out racism and discrimination.
Secretary of State.
Well, I thank my honourable friend, and she's right to again draw attention to the importance of accountability in making maternity services operate as they should, and that applies to the racism, the discrimination, the inequality that she described as being so important that we tackle. Ultimately, it is right that I, as Secretary of State, that all ministers in the government are held to account by Parliament about us, our actions in this space. But we also need to make sure that that accountability is spread throughout the system, which is why our decision to extend the anti-discrimination programme across all trusts by the end of 2027 will be an important first step in making sure that all trusts are held accountable for tackling discrimination and racism where it exists. But more broadly, it will be part of the National Action Plan that we'll publish by the end of the year, which will explain exactly how we will embed that accountability in terms of racism and discrimination right throughout the system.
Ms Jarvis.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Recommendation 3 in the report calls for improvements in how the system responds when something goes wrong, including providing a sincere apology. Will the Minister apologise now to my constituents Charlotte and James, who lost their baby Nora at Winchester Hospital, and the thousands of families who have suffered the loss of a baby due to systemic failures in NHS maternity care?
Secretary of State.
I thank the Honourable Lady for her comments, and I'm incredibly sorry to hear about her constituents, Charlotte and James, and their baby Nora. I met some of the families in Nottingham 2 weeks ago, and the depth of pain was, and I quote a word that someone in the room said to me, numbing, because it was so heavy to hear and to understand. What made me feel even more numb was to recognise that that pain, that deep pain, is replicated so many times. It's the breadth of the pain as well. It's the sheer scale of it. And I think hearing about her constituents, Charlotte, James, and their baby Nora, is just one more example of where families have been let down by NHS maternity services. And that is why this is a responsibility that weighs heavy on all of us and weighs heavy on me as Secretary of State to do something about.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I welcome the Secretary of State's statement and the work of Baroness Amos on this vital report. Disabled women are 44% more likely to suffer a stillbirth than non-disabled women. Drawing on the evidence session I chaired with our Maternable campaign of disabled mothers, Baroness Amos' report highlights the devastating discrimination and structural barriers causing such inequalities for disabled women, from devastating assumptions that we are not sexually active or capable of parenting, to the lack of accessible maternity spaces and medical equipment, as well as insufficient access to BSL interpreters. It sets out the appalling lack of coordination and continuity of care across maternity pathways and services for disabled mothers. Will the Secretary of State meet with me to ensure disabled women's voices are central to the Government's task force and in implementing the report's recommendation by overcoming the inequalities we face in our maternity care?
Secretary of State.
I thank my honourable friend, and she's an incredibly powerful advocate for the discrimination that disabled mothers face within the health service, but particularly maternity services. She talks about both the discrimination and the barriers to accessing care, and I think she's right to point to them being wide and systemic, and this is something which needs to be addressed as part of the comprehensive action plan. I'd be very happy for myself or a member of my ministerial team to meet with her to discuss this in more detail.
Ellie Chowns.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I welcome the investigation by Baroness Amos, which has shone a light on the fact that these failings in maternity services are not isolated to one hospital or another, but across the piece. The Secretary of State identifies rightly that culture is at the centre of this, and that we must listen to the voices of women, and we must listen to the voices of whistleblowers. And that doesn't just apply to maternity services, it applies across the NHS and indeed in public life more widely. He's spoken about accountability, starting from the top, but I noticed he swerved the question earlier about whether he would come back to this House to report on progress against the goals he has set himself. It is shocking and shameful that black women are 3 times more likely to die than white women in maternity. Will he commit to coming back to the chamber and to reporting and holding himself to account to change those racial disparities and to ensure true equity in healthcare?
I thank the Honourable Lady, and I absolutely agree that I, as Secretary of State, must be held to account, and that is the role of this House. I will take that away and work out the best way of making sure that happens on a basis that people can understand and know what timetable it happens to, because I'd like to make sure that I'm held to account for the delivery of the whole action plan and what the right way of doing that is. But let me take that away and come back to her with an update.
Bel Ribeiro-Addy.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I also want to put on record my thanks to Baroness Amos and her team and the families who relived their pain so that this report could exist. They are the real heroes here. And I welcome the report and the new neonatal and maternity commissioner that's been announced. It's vital, I believe, that the report recognise structural racism, but this will mean nothing unless it becomes national standards that tackle inequality and deliver high quality care for every mother and their baby. The report, I note, stops short at recommending a target to bring to an end racial disparities in maternity care, and perhaps that's because the commitment was ours to keep in our manifesto. In April, the Minister for Secondary Care told this House that the target to end racial disparities in maternity outcomes will be informed by these recommendations. They are published now. Will the Secretary of State finally give us a timetable to deliver it? I remind him that black women are 3 times more likely to die in pregnancy and childbirth. Their babies are twice as likely to be stillborn. These are not statistics. They are mothers and children who are still dying. We promised a target at the last election. Without one, we cannot measure progress and we cannot end this disparity.
State.
I thank my honourable friend, and she is right to draw attention to the disparity in what black women and their babies experience in the health service and the extra risks that they face in maternity services in particular. The task force will produce a comprehensive action plan by the end of the year, and that will include with it, I anticipate it will include with it metrics about delivery and ways of monitoring progress. So I'll make sure that her comments in that regard are fed into the work that it carries out.
Bobby Dean.
Deputy Speaker. To deliver on this review's recommendation in full is going to require serious capital investment. Just last week we heard about the hospital in my constituency in St Helier considering closing its maternity unit altogether due to potentially unsafe pipework. So will the government commit to reviewing the phasing of the new hospitals programme, or at the very least providing the funds required to keep those buildings safe and open until the delivery of a new building?
I thank the honourable gentleman. In terms of capital investment, as I set out in my statement earlier, we've announced an extra £41 million specifically to address critical safety issues in maternity and neonatal services. That funding is on top of the funding already in place, but will help address those critical safety issues. The wider action plan will set out our overall approach, and whilst of course, funding will be a consideration for what the government does. I would again draw attention to the importance of deep-rooted issues like culture, which must be addressed as part of the plan.
Zubair Ahmed.